In the spring of 1851, a portrait was commissioned at the Ashford plantation in the low country of South Carolina. It showed a prosperous planter's family, stern-faced patriarchs, corseted wives, and carefully arranged children, the visual proof of their wealth and legitimacy. But this photograph concealed something far darker, a systematic program of forced reproduction that would remain buried in silence for 173 years. The true faces in that photograph were never recorded. They were the children of enslaved women, born from calculated arrangements orchestrated by plantation elites. Their names were never written in official registries. Their births were never acknowledged. They were ghosts on paper, erased from history before they even took their first breath. In 2024, when Martha Elaine Garrison, a 97-year-old former nurse and daughter of a plantation midwife, lay dying in a Charleston hospice, she finally revealed what her mother had whispered to her in shame. The truth about the Ashford plantation's breeding program, the photograph that was meant to hide it, and the 173 missing children whose lives were commodified, separated, and forgotten. This is the story of how a single photograph became evidence, of how silence protected a crime across generations, and of how, in the digital age, one dying woman's conscience finally broke that silence wide open. Before you continue, subscribe and turn on notifications. Here, we excavate secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The spring of 1851 was a season of prosperity at Ashford Plantation. The cotton yield had exceeded all expectations, and the Ashford family, led by patriarch Samuel Ashford III, commissioned a formal family portrait to commemorate their station. It was an expensive undertaking, requiring a traveling photographer to make the 3-week journey from Philadelphia to the South Carolina Low Country. The photograph that emerged from that session became a document of calculated deception. In it, Samuel Ashford stood with his arm across the shoulder of his wife, Constance, their 5 children arranged in perfect formation around them. The image was striking. Prosperity rendered in daguerreotype, a family so cleanly composed that it seemed to represent the natural order of Southern society. But the photograph was a lie of omission. In the servants' quarters of Ashford Plantation, 17 women lived in conditions of systematic reproductive exploitation. None of them appeared in the portrait. None of them were named. But their bodies, and the children they were forced to bear, were the hidden foundation upon which the Ashford family's wealth and social standing genuinely rested. The photograph's significance didn't emerge until 173 years later, when Martha Elaine Garrison, aged 97, requested that a daguerreotype belonging to her late mother be examined by a local historian. Martha had kept the original photograph in a cedar box for 60 years, never quite understanding why her mother had clutched it with such anguish before her death in 1962. "Burn it," her mother had whispered. "Let no one see what it really means." Martha didn't burn it. Instead, she kept it in darkness. When the image was finally analyzed in 2024 using enhanced digital reconstruction, historians noticed something impossible to see in the original: faint pencil marks in the margins, annotations written in a careful, deliberate hand. The marks corresponded to 5 of the Ashford children, with numbers beside them: 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then, below those annotations, additional numbers continuing far past 5, 6, 7, 8, continuing upward to 43, 56, 73, and ultimately reaching a 173. The photograph, it seemed, was not just a record of the Ashford family. It was a catalogue, a ledger rendered in light and shadow. The handwriting matched Martha's mother's own documentation, records that would later be compared to courthouse documents, plantation logs, and parish burial records that had been sealed or misplaced for decades. What emerged from that comparison was the architecture of horror. a systematic program of forced reproduction, meticulously recorded in margins, hidden in plain sight within the very image meant to celebrate Ashford family legitimacy. The photograph had been designed to lie, but it had inadvertently documented the crime it was meant to conceal. Martha Elaine Garrison was born in 1927 to a woman named Catherine Vale, who worked as the Ashford family's midwife from 1895 until her forced retirement in 1933. Catherine was a black woman of extraordinary skill. She had trained in the old traditions, learned under an older midwife named Senna, who had been present at nearly every birth on the low country plantations for 40 years. Senna was dead by the time Catherine took over her role, but the knowledge she had passed down carried with it a terrible burden. Catherine became custodian of secrets that no person should have had to keep. Midwives, by the nature of their work, were entrusted with the most intimate truths of plantation life. They attended births of white children and enslaved women in the same week, sometimes in the same day. They knew which pregnancies were acknowledged and celebrated, and which were denied, hidden, and hastily arranged to be given away, or worse. They knew the difference between a birth and a disappearance. Catherine Vale knew all of these things, and the weight of that knowledge hollowed her out from the inside. Throughout the 1890s and into the early 1900s, Catherine attended to the reproductive needs of the Ashford family, delivering the legitimate children whose births would be announced in newspapers and recorded in family Bibles. But she also attended to the forced pregnancies of the women enslaved or bound to the plantation. She delivered their children in darkness, in hastily constructed cabins, or in the back rooms of the big house, depending on the arrangement that had been made. She kept no official records, no names were written down. The births were oral transactions, acknowledged only in whispers, and then systematically erased from memory, as if they had never happened at all. But Catherine couldn't forget. No midwife could. In 1933, at the age of 61, Catherine was suddenly retired from her position. The official reason was her age and declining health. The real reason, Martha would later understand, was that Catherine had begun to refuse certain assignments. She had begun to resist. She had begun to speak about what she had witnessed. Catherine spent the last 30 years of her life, from 1933 to 1962, in a small house on the outskirts of Charleston, working occasionally as a private nurse and midwife for black families who sought her expertise. She never worked for the Ashford family again. She never set foot on plantation grounds, but she documented everything. In careful, deliberate handwriting, Catherine recorded what she had witnessed: dates, names of the women who had given birth, descriptions of the children who had been taken, annotations on the official records that didn't match the reality she had observed. She created a secret archive, hidden and preserved, waiting for someone to understand its significance. That someone was her daughter, Martha. Martha had always known that her mother carried a terrible secret. As a child, she had watched Catherine examine the daguerreotype of the Ashford family with an expression of profound anguish. She had seen her mother add those faint pencil marks to the margins, numbering the children, documenting something that Martha didn't yet understand. It wasn't until Martha was in her 80s that her mother's lifetime of careful documentation finally made sense. And by then, Catherine was gone, leaving only her daughter to decide what to do with the truth. The Ashford family's forced reproduction program didn't begin with Samuel Ashford III. It had been established decades earlier, during the height of the plantation's expansion in the 1820s, under his father, Samuel Ashford II. What Samuel III did was systematize it, rationalize it, and transform it from an ad hoc exploitation into a calculated demographic strategy. The logic, from the perspective of plantation economics, was straightforward and horrifying. Enslaved women were valuable primarily for their reproductive capacity. A woman who bore children produced not only future labor, but also increased the plantation's assessed wealth. A woman who bore many children, strategically selected for breeding characteristics, produced a renewable resource that required no external purchase. The Ashford family's innovation was to create a formal program. Women were selected based on criteria that plantation records described only obliquely: strong constitution, suitable heritage, bearing. They were then paired with men, sometimes enslaved men from the plantation itself, sometimes men brought in specifically for breeding purposes, sometimes white overseers, or even members of the Ashford family itself. The arrangement was never consensual. Refusal was not an option. Resistance brought punishment. Catherine Vale's hidden documentation recorded the clinical details of this program with the precision of someone who had been forced to participate in its mechanics. Between 1880 and 1930, she had attended the births of 173 children born to women enslaved or bound to Ashford Plantation. Of those 173 children, only 23 had been permitted to remain with their mothers. The remaining 150 had been taken almost immediately after birth. Some had been sold to other plantations. Some had been sent to work camps. Some had been apprenticed out to other families. Some, and this was the detail that appeared most frequently in Catherine's annotations, had simply disappeared from any record at all. The children who were permitted to remain were those whose fathers were white plantation elites. These children occupied an ambiguous position, too white to be enslaved under the most stringent interpretations of law, but too black to be acknowledged as legitimate family members. They lived in a legal and social limbo, sometimes employed as house servants, sometimes trained for skilled trades, but always marked by their origins and forever separated from their mothers' families. The photograph of 1851 had been commissioned, Catherine's notes suggested, to document the respectable outcome of this program. The 5 Ashford children shown in the portrait were, according to Catherine's annotations, the acknowledged children of Samuel III and his white wife, Constance. But the numbers in the margins, the 173 children documented in total, represented an alternative genealogy, one that connected the Ashford family to a history of systematic reproductive violence that no official record could acknowledge. The 1851 photograph was meant to present the Ashford family as a triumph of natural order and legitimate inheritance. Instead, it became an accounting ledger for a crime that would remain hidden for nearly 2 centuries. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching this from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Between 1851 and 1930, the official historical record of Ashford Plantation presented a narrative of steady prosperity and inherited legitimacy. The Ashford family appeared in state records as exemplary planters, their wealth increasing steadily through cotton production and judicious land acquisition. Their children married well, moved to Charleston or Columbia, and took positions in state government and business. The family was respectable. The family was successful. The family was, by all available documentary evidence, entirely legitimate. But beneath this official narrative, a different history was unfolding, one that existed only in the memories of the people who had lived it, preserved in oral tradition and carefully hidden documentation. After the end of slavery and the Reconstruction period, the Ashford family's reproductive program simply transformed rather than ceased. Where they could no longer legally hold women in enslaved conditions, they used sharecropping arrangements, debt bondage, and systematic economic coercion to maintain reproductive control. The logic remained the same. Women's bodies were resources to be managed, and their offspring were property to be distributed according to the family's economic and social interests. Catherine Vale's medical role made her complicit in ways that would haunt her for the remainder of her life. She delivered these children. She assessed their viability. She made recommendations about which ones would be kept and which would be removed. She documented it all in a careful, meticulous hand that seemed to grow heavier with each entry, as if the weight of accumulated knowledge was pressing down through her pen onto the page. By the early 1930s, when Catherine was forced into retirement, the program was already beginning to wind down. The economic collapse of the Great Depression made the systematic breeding program economically irrational. The costs of maintaining reproductive control exceeded the benefits. Additionally, federal policies and changing labor dynamics were making the old plantation system increasingly untenable. But Catherine's retirement wasn't simply a bureaucratic convenience, it was a deliberate erasure. The Ashford family understood that Catherine represented a living archive of their crimes. She knew too much. She had documented too much. And as she aged and began to speak more openly about what she had witnessed, she had become a liability. Her forced removal from the plantation wasn't presented as a punishment. It was framed as a natural consequence of age and changing times. The official record simply noted that Miss Catherine Vale has retired from her position as midwife, effective immediately due to health considerations. No further explanation appeared in any surviving document, but Catherine's own hidden archive revealed the truth. She had been removed because she had begun to refuse certain assignments, to resist the program that she had been forced to facilitate. She had threatened to speak, and so she was silenced, not through direct violence, but through the more subtle coercion of removal, displacement, and economic vulnerability. For the next 30 years, Catherine kept her documentation hidden. She told her daughter, Martha, fragments of what she knew, but she didn't reveal the full archive until she was on her deathbed, barely conscious, whispering instructions about the daguerreotype and the marks she had made in its margins. "Burn it," she had said, contradicting herself moments before she had insisted that Martha preserve it. The contradictions reflected the terrible position Catherine occupied. The desperate desire to erase evidence of her own complicity mixed with the equally desperate need to ensure that the truth would eventually emerge. Martha chose preservation over destruction, and in doing so, she became the guardian of a secret that would reshape understanding of her own family's history, the Ashford family's legacy, and the hidden architecture of violence that had been built into the very foundation of the South Carolina Low Country. The silence that had protected the Ashford family for generations had finally been broken, but it would take another 70 years before anyone was positioned to understand what Catherine Vale had been trying to tell them. Martha Elaine Garrison inherited her mother's burden when she was 35 years old. Catherine Vale died in 1962 after requesting that Martha take possession of the cedar box containing the daguerreotype and the accompanying documentation. Martha had been a nurse herself by that time, continuing the family tradition of medical work, though in more legitimate and less compromised circumstances than her mother had been forced to endure. For 60 years, Martha carried the cedar box without opening it. She had married and divorced twice. She had raised 3 children. She had worked in hospitals across South Carolina and into Georgia, maintaining a quiet professional reputation as a competent and compassionate nurse. But the cedar box never left her possession. It traveled with her through every move, every relocation, every change of circumstance. It sat in closets and attics, a constant, silent presence that Martha acknowledged but never directly confronted. The weight of the box was not in its physical mass. The daguerreotype and documents inside weighed almost nothing. The weight was in what Martha knew the box contained, evidence of a crime that belonged not to her, but that she had inherited the responsibility of keeping safe. Martha understood, on some level, what her mother had been trying to communicate through the photograph. She had seen the annotations in the margins. She had understood, in a child's intuitive way, that the numbers meant something terrible. But she had also understood that to open that box fully, to examine that documentation completely, would be to accept a burden of historical truth that might destroy her. So she waited. She raised her children with a commitment to truth-telling and integrity that surprised people who knew her. She became known as someone who could be trusted with secrets, someone who would not lie about difficult things. She chose professions, nursing, care work, that required honesty about suffering and mortality. And she kept the cedar box. In 2022, Martha's health began to decline. She was diagnosed with a degenerative condition and told that she had perhaps 3 or 4 years remaining. The diagnosis, paradoxically, brought clarity. Martha was approaching the same age at which her mother had died. She was facing mortality, and she realized, with sudden urgency, that the burden she had been carrying could not remain hidden forever. In early 2023, Martha finally opened the cedar box and examined its contents completely. The daguerreotype was exactly as she remembered it. The Ashford family in their formal portrait, stern-faced and prosperous. But now, examining it with the enhanced digital technology available in the 21st century, Martha could see what her mother had seen: the careful pencil annotations in the margins, the systematic numbering, the meticulous documentation of a crime that had been hidden in the margins of a respectable family portrait. Alongside the daguerreotype were Catherine Vale's written records, page after page of careful documentation in her mother's unmistakable handwriting, names of women, dates of births, descriptions of infants, cryptic notes about where children had been sent. The records spanned from 1880 to 1930, a half-century of methodical recording, performed by someone who understood that documentation might eventually serve as evidence. Martha realized that her mother had created this archive not to preserve her own complicity, but to create a historical record that might, someday, serve as testimony to what had happened. Martha spent the next year consulting with historians, genealogists, and archivists. She began the process of cross-referencing her mother's documentation with official records, plantation logs, courthouse documents, parish burial records, census data, deed records. Many of these records had been sealed, destroyed, or misplaced, but enough survived to corroborate Catherine Vale's documentation. What emerged was a detailed portrait of systematic reproductive violence, preserved in margins and hidden archives, documented by a woman who had been forced to participate in it and who had ultimately chosen to create a counter-narrative that might survive her own death. In 2024, at age 97, Martha made the decision to make her mother's archive public. She worked with local historians and journalists to verify the documentation and to begin the process of identifying the descendants of the 173 children whose existence had been systematically erased from official historical records. Martha's inheritance of her mother's burden had not destroyed her. Instead, it had given her life a purpose: to ensure that the silenced voices of the past would be heard in the present. When Martha Garrison's story first emerged in local Charleston media in January 2024, the initial response was skepticism. The claim that a 97-year-old woman possessed documentation of a 173-year-old systematic breeding program seemed implausible to many. Academic historians were cautious. Descendants of the Ashford family were vehemently dismissive. But then the verification began. A team of researchers at the University of South Carolina, working in collaboration with genealogists and archivists, began the painstaking process of cross-referencing Catherine Vale's documentation with surviving official records. The results were undeniable. Where Catherine's notes indicated a birth date and location, courthouse records frequently contained corresponding entries that had been marked as miscellaneous or irregular. Where Catherine noted that a child had been sent to a specific location, deed records and apprenticeship documents could sometimes be found that matched the timeline and description. The documentation was fragmentary and difficult to interpret. Official records had been deliberately obscured, misfiled, or destroyed. But enough evidence survived to establish that Catherine Vale's archive was fundamentally accurate. A systematic program of forced reproduction had indeed been conducted on the Ashford plantation between 1820 and 1930. The 1851 photograph emerged as central evidence. The daguerreotype had been taken specifically to document the legitimate outcome of the breeding program, the 5 children of Samuel III and Constance Ashford, whose existence could be acknowledged within the family's structure and legal system. But the marginal annotations, revealed through careful digital reconstruction, indicated that these 5 children were being catalogued alongside 168 others whose existence was not officially acknowledged. The numbers in the margins weren't arbitrary. They corresponded to Catherine Vale's written documentation, which she had organized chronologically and systematically. Each number represented a child. Each child represented a story that had been erased, silenced, and hidden. Historians working with the archive began identifying descendants. Some of the 173 children whose births had been documented by Catherine had survived to adulthood and had produced their own families. Their descendants lived throughout the southeast, many of them unaware of the specific history of reproductive violence that had produced their family lines. The genealogical detective work was painful and sometimes heartbreaking. Many of the children documented by Catherine had not survived to adulthood. Infant mortality among the forced populations was extremely high. Others had been sold, separated, or dispersed in ways that made family reunification almost impossible. But some lineages could be traced with reasonable confidence, and the descendants of those children began to emerge publicly as the story developed. If this story has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps the story of Martha Garrison and the Ashford plantation reach more people. By the middle of 2024, descendants of the 173 children documented in Catherine Vale's archive began to come forward publicly. Many of them had family stories, oral traditions passed down through generations, that aligned with the dates and circumstances documented in Catherine's records. They had stories of ancestors who had been taken away at birth, of family separations that had never been explained, of gaps in genealogical records that had confused researchers for generations. One descendant, a woman named Patricia Simmons, who lived in Atlanta, had grown up hearing her grandmother tell a story about a child who had been taken to the big house at birth and never returned. The grandmother had always believed the child had died, but she had never been given an explanation. Patricia had carried that story and that unanswered grief throughout her life. When Patricia learned of Catherine Vale's archive and saw that a child matching her grandmother's description had been documented as born to an enslaved woman at Ashford Plantation in 1904, she experienced a moment of devastating clarity. Her own existence depended on that separation, that forced arrangement. The child who had been taken had been her grandfather. The woman who had given birth had been her great-grandmother, and Patricia had never known her name. Patricia wasn't alone in this experience. Dozens of descendants came forward to connect their family histories to the documentation in Catherine Vale's archive. Some were descendants of the women who had been forced into reproduction. Others were descendants of the children who had been taken and dispersed. All of them carried the weight of that hidden history, even when they hadn't fully understood its source. One of the most striking discoveries emerged when researchers began examining the descendants of the Ashford family itself. Several contemporary members of the Ashford family People who had no idea about the systematic breeding program discovered through genealogical testing and archival research that they had relatives among the 173 documented children. The reproductive arrangements that had been so systematically documented by Catherine Vale meant that the boundaries between the legitimate Ashford family and the population of forced offspring were far more porous than anyone had realized. This discovery prompted a profound reckoning within the Ashford family. Some members responded with denial and hostility. Others confronted the historical reality of their family's complicity in systematic violence, a reckoning that was painful and, for many, transformative. A formal apology from the contemporary Ashford family was issued in September 2024, acknowledging the systematic reproductive violence conducted under their family name and expressing commitment to supporting historical documentation and descendant community initiatives. The apology was careful, legalistic, and insufficient. Apologies offered 173 years after the initial crimes can never be adequate. But it represented an official acknowledgement that what had happened was real, was documented, and was criminal. For many descendants, the acknowledgement mattered less than the documentation. What had been silenced for generations was now a matter of public record. What had been erased from official history was now being recovered, examined, and preserved. The children who had been taken and dispersed were being recognized, even if only through documents and genealogical records. Catherine Vale's archive had succeeded in its ultimate purpose. It had created a historical record that ensured the truth would eventually emerge, no matter how long the silence had lasted. As the research and genealogical work continued throughout 2024, the 1851 photograph of the Ashford family took on new significance. What had initially been understood as evidence of the breeding program, the marginal annotations that documented the 173 children, was re-examined by art historians, archivists, and historians of photography. The daguerreotype was from a crucial moment in American photographic history. Photography was still new, still expensive. Still a technology that required significant resources and technical expertise. A formal family portrait in 1851 was a statement of wealth, status, and permanence. The Ashford family had commissioned the photograph specifically because it would endure, because it would serve as a visual record of their legitimacy and prosperity for generations to come. What became clear through deeper analysis was that the photograph had been designed as a deception, but that the very act of deception had produced evidence. The careful composition, the formal arrangement, the calculated presentation of the 5 legitimate children, all of this was meant to obscure the reality that the Ashford family's wealth and demographic expansion depended on systematic reproductive violence. But Samuel Ashford III, or whoever had designed the composition, had apparently commissioned the photographer to include Catherine Vale's annotations in the margins. Or perhaps Catherine had added them herself afterward, knowing that the photograph would be preserved and that future generations might eventually be able to read what the margins contained. Either way, the photograph had become a palimpsest, an image of false legitimacy with hidden documentation of crime written beneath the surface. The 5 acknowledged children in the portrait seemed to stare out with the weight of that hidden history pressing against the frame. The photograph was exhibited in 2024 at the University of South Carolina, accompanied by Catherine Vale's written documentation and interactive digital displays that allowed visitors to examine the marginal annotations in detail. The exhibition, titled The Photograph's Hidden Witness, became a pilgrimage site for descendants seeking to connect with their family histories and for historians studying the mechanics of how historical violence is concealed, documented, and eventually revealed. The daguerreotype had been created to lie, but it had inadvertently preserved the truth, waiting 173 years for someone with the courage to examine it closely and to read what had been written in the margins. In her final interviews, conducted in the hospice in Charleston, where Martha Garrison spent her last weeks, Martha spoke about what it had meant to carry her mother's secret for 6 decades. She spoke about the responsibility of stewardship, the burden of knowledge, and the particular pain of understanding that her own family's professional reputation had been built in part on complicity with systematic violence. Martha died in October 2024 at age 97. She had lived long enough to see her mother's archive recognized, verified, and made public. She had lived long enough to know that the 173 children documented by Catherine Vale would no longer be entirely erased from history. But Martha also spoke about what remained unfinished. Many of the 173 documented children remain unidentified. Their descendants remain unknown or unconnected to the historical record. The systematic destruction of records means that some of what Catherine Vale documented can never be fully corroborated through official channels. The archive is incomplete, fragmentary, and imperfect, a mirror of how historical violence leaves incomplete traces and resists perfect documentation. Catherine Vale's decision to document the breeding program had not been simple. It represented both complicity and resistance. Complicity because Catherine had participated in the system, and resistance because she had created a counter-narrative that might eventually serve as historical testimony. Catherine hadn't been a hero. She had been a woman trapped in an impossible position, forced to participate in violence, and who had used the only power available to her, the power of careful documentation, to create a possibility of eventual truth. Martha had inherited that same impossible position. For 60 years, she had carried the burden of her mother's documentation without knowing quite what to do with it. She had been complicit through silence, but she had ultimately chosen revelation. Her choice had transformed an archive from a secret burden into a public historical record. The descendants of the 173 children continue to organize, to conduct genealogical research, and to work with historians and archivists to uncover additional information about their family histories. Many of them are engaged in efforts to create a permanent memorial to those whose existence was systematically erased from official records. Some are pursuing legal actions against the Ashford family and the state of South Carolina. Others are focused on supporting cultural and community initiatives that honor the memories of those who were silenced. The 1851 photograph continues to circulate through academic conferences, museum exhibitions, and historical publications. Each time it is examined, new details emerge. Each time it is analyzed, the marginal annotations reveal new information about the systematic nature of the breeding program and its specific victims. What Catherine Vale understood, and what her daughter Martha ultimately acted upon, was that truth has a way of emerging, even when it has been systematically hidden. Silence protects violence only temporarily. Documentation, carefully created and patiently preserved, eventually becomes testimony. The margins can be read, the hidden can be revealed, the erased can be remembered. The photograph that the Ashford family commissioned in 1851 to demonstrate their legitimacy and prosperity has instead become a document of their crimes. The image that was meant to erase has become evidence. The silence that protected the violence for 173 years has finally been broken. And in that breaking of silence, the possibility emerges of finally honoring the 173 children whose existence was documented in careful handwriting, whose absence was recorded in margins, and whose lives, though they were taken, separated, and often destroyed, are now being remembered, examined, and restored to historical consciousness. Subscribe to the channel to discover more forbidden stories and those forgotten by history. Thank you for following the case of the Ashford plantation and the 173 documented children. We'll see you on the next video.